Good morning, guys. It is 8 a.m. in the morning and I am currently at the trailhead for the White Oak Canyon Cedar Run Falls. Yeah, so it took me about 2 hours to drive here from Alexandria. Just arrived and there was only just one other car already in the parking lot. I think this might be a 3 to 4 hour round trip loop. So yeah, I think I'm just going to start making my way now. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a ranger or if there's like some permits I need to arrange. Right, so just as I was filling in the pass, these two rangers came to start their shift, I guess, and told me that I don't need to fill it out now and I'll just pay for it when I come back. And away we go. Right guys, so after 45 minutes, I think I've arrived at the waterfalls, which I think has got to be the Cedar Runs waterfall. I'm trying to look for this Tarzan swing, which I thought I saw in some other YouTube videos actually. Maybe it's further up there. Right, I'm going to continue hiking up. Right, so I couldn't find any Tarzan swings, but I managed to hike off trail to work my way up behind and then kind of cross like the waterfall at the top, just so I could get to essentially the top of the waterfalls. There's a lot of bugs around here. It's quite a nice spot actually. Might sit here for a bit and then I'll go for a swim down there later on. So I just went for a little bit of a swim in the Cedar Run Falls and yeah, it's pretty refreshing. It's quite treacherous trying to wade into the main like waterfall area because there's quite a lot of like dodgy like rocks and it's quite slippery, so you do need to be careful when you like wading in towards the waterfalls. And when you actually get in there, the water does get a lot deeper, so you can actually swim around. Yeah, it's quite a nice spot. Alright guys, so here we are at the Cedar Runs Fall. I've already hiked to the waterfall. I hiked up there where I could actually see the waterfall going down. And I also then finally went for a brief swim just to cool down. Right, so this session that I want to talk through in today's video happened on Thursday last week. So I arrived into the casino at my usual time of around 1 p.m. Straight after I pick up my usual Californian burrito at District Tacos, and then we register ourselves for the 2-5 game. So in this first interesting hand of my 2-5 session, the action folds to a middle position player who decides to limp in for $5. The action then folds all the way to me on the button, and I look down at full deuce of diamonds. With this hand and being on the button, I definitely want to play this hand. The question is on whether or not we want to raise or just limp in. If I open to my standard $20 raise, I think I'm going to get called in multiple spots. So therefore I'll lean more towards limping in here rather than raising. So therefore I decide to also limp in. The small blind completes and the big blind checks his option. So we are now going 4 ways to the flop, which comes 6, jack, 3, rainbow. To my surprise, the small blind, instead of checking, decides to lead out into 3 opponents here for $20. The big blind decides to make the call, the middle position folds, and now the action is now on us. Now in this spot, I think we can go either way here. We can either call or raise. I think folding is out of the question, especially given how deep all the stacks are. I think everyone is playing about 1k deep. So with all of this considered, I decided to continue with a flat call. So we're now off to the turn card, and on the turn, the dealer puts out the 5 of hearts. So we managed to bink our gut shot for the straight. Small blind checks, and now big blind decides to take over the betting lead, and he decides to put out a bet for $40. I think we should definitely be putting in a raise here more often than just calling here. I think a 4x sizing here probably makes the most sense to me. So in this scenario, I decided to put in a raise to $155. So after I put in the raise, the small blind quickly makes the fold, and the action is now back on the big blind. The big blind goes into the tank, and he's thinking about what to do, and eventually he decides to continue with a call. We are now off to the river card here, and I'm very clear on from the kind of river cards that I really don't want to see, namely any hearts or any card that pairs the board, as I think 2 pairs, sets and flush draws are the most likely hands that are going to be continuing versus my raise on the turn. On the river, the dealer puts out the 9 of hearts. Villain looks at the river card, he pauses for a little bit before eventually deciding on a check. This is really good news for my hand, as it means that we are now unlikely to be beat. But even so, it is still a really bad river card, because as our hand now loses a lot of value against worse hands, which are a lot less likely to be calling us now. Given that our hands lost quite a lot of value, and going with my read that my opponent could have some flushes in the spot, and I'm not so keen on value owning myself, I decide to make a relatively tight check back and take this hand to showdown. And villain tables Jack 5 offsuit for a turned 2 pair. I then table my hand for the winner, and I get to drag in this first medium-sized pot of the session. So shortly after that hand, I decided to change tables as the action on my table was pretty dead. We moved to the action table where I played the biggest pot of the session. So in this hand, the straddle is on and we are playing short-handed. I think there's like 5 or maybe 6 players at this table. The action falls to the cutoff, who is a 5-10 reg and is also a somewhat of a higher stakes player. And he decides to open for $30. The action is now on me on the button, and I look down at King 10 of spades. In this spot, we can 3-bet or we can call. On this instance, I decide to continue with a flat call. The small blind folds, the big blind folds, but the straddler decides to make the call. So we are now going 3 ways to the flop, and the flop comes Queen 8-8 with 2 spades. So all in all, not too bad of a flop for our hand. The straddler checks and the cutoff decides to put in a small c-bet of $20. In this spot, facing a relatively small c-bet sizing, I think we can go both ways here between calling and raising. I think with this small sizing, I think villain could quite easily have like a Queen X or maybe a worse flush draw. And given that we have a flush draw with a card that's higher than the Queen, that gives us a little bit more equity versus his Queen X hands. I think I would like to increase the frequency at which I would be raising here rather than calling. The most likely hands that we're going to get called by would be Queen X and flush draws, and we'd be able to continue barreling on almost all 10 cards, barring a Queen or an 8. For that reason, I think I prefer taking the more aggressive line here. Having considered all of the above, I decided to put in a raise to just $60. The straddler quickly makes the fold, and the action is now back on the cutoff. And the cutoff doesn't actually think for too long before making the call. So we are now off to a turn card, and on the turn, the dealer puts out the 5 of spades. The cutoff decides to quickly check, and now the action's on us. We've made our strong flush here. We now beat all of his top pairs and over pairs, and we only really lose here to ace-high flush draws. In this spot, I do like to continue going for a bet here, and just thinking about the type of hands that we're most likely going to be getting value from here. It should most likely be weaker flushes, maybe some ace-queen type hands with the ace of spades, maybe even some pocket aces with the ace of spades, and also on some rarer occasions, villain could also even have some 8x type hands. So versus this range, which is relatively strong, I think I do want to size up a little bit here, maybe go for like a near 2/3 pot type size bet. I decided to put out another bet of $125. Villain now goes into the tank, and after considering all of his options, he eventually decides to make the call. The pot now swells to over $400, and we are off to the river card. On the river, the dealer puts out an offsuit 4, which is pretty much a complete brick. Villain now decides to snap check, and the action is back on us. I think similar to on the turn, we do want to continue extracting value for our hand. I think the range that we've assigned villain on the turn remains the same on the river. I think with a king-high flush, the most money we're going to be making here would be from villain's weaker flushes here. I think if we do decide to continue barreling on the river, I think we would most likely be doing this with flushes. For that reason, I wouldn't really be seeing villain paying us off here with a hand like ace-queen with ace of spades or pocket aces. I think unless we decide to bet very small here, we could maybe get a crying call from a hand like ace-8. But given that I want to maximize my value here versus weaker flushes, I think I do want to go for like another medium to large type sizing. So for that reason, I decided to fire out another barrel of $310. As I made this bet, I didn't actually think too far ahead in terms of what I'll be doing if villain decided to go for a check raise, as I think this should be a very unlikely scenario. But after I do decide to put in the bet, villain now does decide to go deep into the tank. In my mind, I am of course praying for a call, but after maybe 30 seconds or so, villain announces all in. and he jams the rest of his stack into the middle of the table. Villain has us covered here, so basically his jam is for our remaining $400 to $500. I was really sick to my stomach when I saw this bet, and I just couldn't really believe that I'm facing a jam here in the spot, in all honesty. Now it's time for us to kind of replay the hand and think through what kind of a hand that Villain is most likely representing in the spot. So given Villain has decided to jam, I think Villain no longer has weak flushes anymore. He's now repping at least an ace of spades in his hand, or boats, which is so unlikely, I think. I guess the type of hands that Villain is representing here would be pocket queens, queen eight, quad eights, and ace high flushes. I put the ace of spades in Villain's range. Hands like aces with ace of spades and ace queen with ace of spades, which I think, to be fair, would actually make for a really sick bluff here. As I'm in the tank, I'm obviously thinking about what hands that have us beat here, but I'm also equally thinking about what bluffs that Villain could have, which we obviously do have beat as well. And I think the bluffs which would make the most sense to me would have to be hands which include the ace of spades, and in this case I think would have to be like aces with ace of spades or ace queen with ace of spades. And given that this is the 5-10 reg, I did decide to give him some credit for having these type of hands. So what may seem to be like quite a reasonably straightforward spot here against most of the player population. Against this player type, given that I could see him having some bluffs here, albeit his jam here is not for much more from my stack, eventually I did decide to make the crying call, and Villain tables pocket queens for a flopped full house. It may seem obvious in hindsight that this was quite a big blunder from me. Probably should just be folding here. I decided to go with my gut. In this case, my gut was wrong, and we're going to be getting clean stacked here for nearly 1K and losing a massive pot quite early on in our session. Can you finish?
Yeah, of course.
So not the best start to the session. We're stuck in the hole for a clean stack, and we have our work cut out for us. Right, so in this next hand, the $10 straddle is on. The action falls to the small blind, who decides to put in a raise to $30. The big blind folds, and I look down in the straddle at Jack 7 offsuit. Although this is quite a weak hand here, given that we're facing just a 3x raise, we're in position, and we're playing over 100 big blinds deep, I decide to commit the chips and make the call. We are now heads up to the flop, and the flop comes Queen Jack 7 with 2 clubs, and I don't think we have any clubs on our hand. Villain decides to continue for a C-bet of $30. Of course, it's a good flop. We have 2 pair here, but we do need to bear in mind that it is bottom 2 pair, and also there are a bunch of straight and flush draws out there, which does significantly decrease the strength of our hand. I think the only thing I like about this hand is that we have position, so we can more easily navigate turns and rivers and control the size of the pot when we need to. Given that the playability of this hand, I think, is quite low, I lean more towards continuing with a call here rather than raising. Both options I think is fine, but I definitely lean more towards calling with my weakest 2 pairs and maybe raising with my stronger 2 pairs, such as Queen Jack. After carefully considering my options, I eventually settle on a call. We are now off to the turn card. The dealer puts out the 8 of hearts. Action is now on Villain, who thinks for a little while before eventually deciding to double barrel. He decides to size up on this turn card to $100. Now, I think this is quite an interesting spot, especially given that Villain's decided to double barrel. Most of Villain's range here, which would be betting the flop and then sizing up on the turn, I think pretty much his entire range has a bunch of equity against us. I think hands such as aces, ace queen, king queen, queen 10, jack 10 suited, a lot of his pairs plus flush draws. I think equities are running very close here. I think most of Villain's range here could quite easily have about 30 to 40% equity versus our exact hand. I think we could go for a freeze play here and maybe raise the turn to maybe like 250 to 300 and then check back on most rivers. But equally, I also don't mind playing position here and just making a call and see what Villain does on the river. After taking a bit of time to consider all of my options, I eventually settle on a call. On the river card, the dealer puts out an offsuit king. On this river card, Villain, fortunately for us, settles on a check. When I see Villain decide to play a check, I obviously feel a lot more better about my hand, as I think more often than not we have him beat. If he does have a bluff catch type hand, then most likely he's going to have a hand like aces or ace queen. I think with our hand, we do need to go for some more value here. I think I like going for a large sizing here to target his ace kings, his ace queens, and maybe some pocket aces. The only hands that we're going to be value owning ourselves against here would be king, queen, and pocket kings. So after going into the tank and deciding what bet sizing I should choose here, I decide to fire out for $330. Fading the dreaded snap call, I'm now praying for Villain to make the call, and after nearly a minute or so, Villain eventually decides to make the call. So that's great news for us. We table our hands and Villain sees the bad news before then quietly mucking his cards. We now get to drag in quite a nice pot here to recover some of our chips from the disastrous king ten of spades hand that we played earlier in the session. Right, so in this next hand, the action folds all the way to the button to someone who I perceive to be quite a tight ABC type player, and he decides to open to $30. The small blind folds, the big blind folds, and I look down in the straddle with 10-9 offsuit. So I decide to make the call and go heads up to the flop. And on the flop, the dealer puts out king 10-5 with 2 clubs. I decide to start with a check, and then Villain decides to continue for a c-bet of $25. I don't think we have much of a decision here. I don't like raising in the spot, and I think folding is certainly out of the question, which only therefore leaves us with one option, which is to continue with the call. So that's what I decide to do. I decide to flick in the chips and make the call. We are now off to the turn card, and on the turn, the dealer puts out an offsuit 9, so we now improve to 2 pair. I decide to continue checking, and then Villain now decides to continue betting, but he does still continue for a relatively small sizing of just $55. Given that we have improved to 2 pair, we do now have the option to raise for value versus his top pair type holdings. However, equally, I do have a read on this player, and that is that his bets are usually very, very strong, especially when he double barrels. Quite often, I've seen this player bet top pair on the flop and then check back on turn cards for pot control. So when I see Villain double barrel here into me, I'm feeling a lot less comfortable with my 2 pair. Given that I do have this specific player read, I am more inclined to just continue calling down here rather than going for a check raise. With this in mind, I do decide to continue with just a flat call. We are now off to the river card, and on the river, the dealer puts out an offsuit 8. On this river card, I think we can go for quite an easy check call. However, I also don't mind leading into my opponent here from time to time. On the rare occasion, Villain does have a strong hand, which we do have beat, such as ace king. Then we can set our own price on the river here to max value against these type of hands, and also, in a way, cap our losses by also equally setting our own price if Villain did have us beat. When we check call the flop and turn, and then lead into our opponent on the river, our hand does look quite strong. So if we do get raised, then I should think we have quite an easy fold. So not wanting to lose any value, if Villain did have a hand like ace king, I decide to donk bet and lead into my opponent for $130. Villain now decides to go into the tank and decide what he wants to do. And after going to the tank, he eventually decides to put in a raise. He raises to $430. Quite a large raise. It's quite a polarized sizing. I think he's trying to say he's flopped a set of kings maybe, or maybe a queen jack perhaps. But in either instance, I don't really see how our 2 pair is good here, especially with this player type. Or perhaps he's even got queen jack for the nuts here. I don't think my 2 pair is good here, so I don't take too long before making the reluctant side fold. So Villain is going to drag in this pot. After that hand, we then go card dead for like another hour or 2 hours or so. By this time, the table had actually changed quite a lot, and some of the players didn't really want to play a straddle, so the table straddles off, and then this time we're going to be playing regular 2-5. So in this hand, the action folds to me in early position, and I look down at pocket 10s. So I make the standard open to $15. And the action then folds to the button, who is an old guy who I perceive to be a very, very tight player, and he decides to come along for a call. The small and big blind folds, so we are now going heads up to the flop. And on the flop, the dealer puts out 10-6-5 all hearts. So we flop top set on a monotone board. So in this spot, as is usually the case when you have strong hands, I think you can go either way here between checking and betting. On this occasion, I decided to play a check and see what my opponent decides to do. Villain on the button then decides to put out a bet of $20. Given my read on this opponent, which is that he is a very tight player, his betting range is typically very, very strong. I definitely don't like check raising here, even with a hand as strong as top set. So I do decide to play this hand cautiously against this player and continue with just a check call. We are now off to the turn card, and on the turn, the dealer just puts out an offsuit deuce. I continue to check twice, and I know this may sound weird, but I'm actually secretly praying for Villain to check back so then I would know I have the best hand. But Villain, unfortunately, he decides to bet twice. He decides to put out a bet of $40. When I see Villain bet twice, I think he has either a set of fives, a set of sixes, or flopped a flush. That's honestly what's going through my mind right now. So there are still hands which we beat, which is sets, but we do lose the flushes. So in this case, I think we can still continue with the call, and I don't think I like raising too much against this player type. That's what I decided to do. I decided to continue with a check call. We are now off to the river card here, and I'm praying for the board to pair here. The dealer puts out the ace of spades, so pretty much a brick on this run out. I think checking probably makes the most sense given the likely hands I've put Villain on. So I decide to check for a third time, and then Villain, to my dismay, does decide to bet 3 times into me for just $75, and I'm really not liking this situation. He has a very, very strong betting range. I think the weakest hand surely he's doing this with is a set of sixes. Most likely he has a flush. I think if I had bottom set here, I would be leaning more towards folding, but with a hand as strong as top set, I don't think I can fold this hand. Eventually, I decide to make the side call, and Villain tables Queen Jack of Hearts for a flopped flush. Fortunately, Villain didn't punish us too much by making massive bet sizes. I do think at least we lost the minimum. The action started dying down, so I decided to make my final table change to find better action and also hopefully to change my luck. So in this next interesting hand, there is an open from middle position to $25, and this is a non-straddled hand. The action unfolds to me on the button, and I look down at pocket jacks. I think this hand would be much better played as a 3-bet to try to knock out the other players behind me and play this hand heads up versus the early position raiser. So I decided to put in a 3-bet here to $80. The action then, as to no surprise, folds all the way back to the early position raiser, who double checks his cards before then eventually deciding to continue with a call. So we are now going heads up to the flop, and the flop comes Queen 5-3 rainbow. Action checks to me, and in this spot I think a hand like pocket jacks would more often than not want to c-bet here, given that although we flopped an underpair to the board, we still have a hand that beats 10s, jacks, 9s and 8s. But having said that, although that would be the higher frequency play, I also don't mind mixing in some low frequency checks here from time to time. And on this occasion, it was one of those times, and I decided to check back. So we are now off to a free turn card, and on the turn, the dealer puts out the 10 of hearts, which now brings in a backdoor flush draw. Villain now decides to lead into me on this turn card, and he decides to put out a bet of $75. Especially given we decided to check the flop, the turn is now a very easy call. Villain could be bluffing here with a hand like ace king or ace jack. He could have even improved with a hand like ace 10, which we do beat. So I decided to commit the chips to make the call, and we are now off to see the river card. And on the river, the dealer puts out the 8 of hearts, and now Villain decides to go into the tank before eventually deciding to put out another bet. He decides to bet $175. I'm not liking this situation now, as given Villain has decided to bet twice into me on the river. I don't think he has a pocket pair in his hand anymore. I think maybe a hand like ace queen, or maybe a slow pay pocket kings would probably make sense. But in either case, I don't think our hand's any good here. And given the way we play the hands, I don't think we can rep many strong hands as well. So I decided to make the side fold, and Villain was actually kind enough to show us that he had ace queen for a flop top pair. So yeah, it sucks that we're going to lose this pot, but I'm happy with the way we played our hand. Moving swiftly on. In this next hand, the $10 straddle is on, and the action folds to me in the hijack, and I look down at pocket 10s. So I decide to make the open to $30. The action then folds to the button, who takes a peek of his cards before going into the tank. And after thinking for a little while, he eventually decides to jam the rest of his stack in for $260. So given that the straddle is on, this is essentially just like a 26 big blind shove. So if the action does fold to me, then I already know in my mind that I'm going to be snapping this off. The action is now on the small blind who makes the fold. The action is now on the big blind who goes into the tank for quite a while before eventually also deciding to fold. So I, of course, snap call, and then villain immediately tables pocket aces. Of course. Flop comes like 8-8 jack, and then the turn's a queen, and then the river's like a 4. Don't get any help from the board, so we are going to be yet again losing another pot.
Or 7 to 5.
And now we come on to the final interesting hand from my session last week. So in this hand, there is a limp from early position to $5. The action then folds all the way to me on the button, and I look down at King Jack of clubs. So I decide to bump it up to $25. The small blind on my left then makes the call before the action then folds all the way back to the early position limper, who also decides to make the call. So we are now going 3 ways to the flop. And the flop comes ace, 10, 9 with 1 club. And it's the ace of clubs on board, so we do have the backdoor nut flush draw. The small blind checks, but then the early position limper decides to put in a bet. He decides to bet $50. Kind of surprising here, as more often than not, I shouldn't really expect to get led into as the non-pre-flop aggressor on an ace high board. But nonetheless, given that we do have a gut shot for the nuts and a backdoor flush draw, and position and with deep stacked, definitely not going anywhere, I decided to continue with a flat call. The action is now on the small blind, who also decides to come along for a call. We are now going 3 ways to the turn card, and on the turn, the dealer puts out the 8 of clubs, which is a great card for my hand. The small blind quickly checks, and the action is now back on the early position limper, who goes into the tank, and eventually, after thinking it through, he decides to put out another bet of $125. At this point in the hand is where I think it gets interesting. For me, it's mainly because of the small blind's flat call. So we're clearly not folding here. So the decision point that we have is, do we call or do we raise? Given that we have the strongest draw, I lean more towards flatting here. I think if we had a weaker draw, I think I'll be more inclined to raising, because I think with a nut draw, we really don't mind having inferior draws continue in this hand, as we would have great implied odds to win quite a lot of money if our hand hits. And I think it's more likely that we are going to be up against at least one other draw here, because we are multi-way. If we were heads up, I think I would be more inclined to raise. And if we were multi-way, I think I lean more towards flatting here. So after being in the tank for a little while, I decided to continue with a flat call. Now it's time for the small blind to go into the tank after taking a little bit of time to decide what to do. He eventually decides to also join the party with a call. So we are now off to the river card here, and I am praying to hit one of my many outs here. The dealer puts out an offsuit 3. Small blind quickly checks. The early position player goes into the tank before eventually deciding to also decide to check. And now the action's on me. And in this spot against 2 players, I think I like bluffing a lot less here. I think there are definitely some strong hands here. I'm thinking like 2 pair plus, maybe sets. And I think one of the other players must have a draw of some kind. So given this, I decide to wave the white flag and give up and check back. Small blind tables 10, 9 of diamonds for a flop 2 pair. And the early position player actually showed us that he had Queen 10 of clubs for a pair plus flush draw on the turn. Disappointed that we couldn't improve on the river card, as I think if we did, I really felt like we were going to get paid off and we're going to be losing yet again one of these medium-sized pots. Right guys, so I've just finished my session for tonight. Yeah, just having a bit of a nightmare, to be honest. And it wasn't just today. It's been like this since I arrived. I can't remember exactly how much I lost now. I think it was 1 or 2K in the first week, and then I lost like a little less in the second week, and then the third week, I think I just kind of broke even. Yesterday, I lost like 1.5K. Today, I lost another 1.5K. I've lost like almost 5K in the last 3 sessions. Yeah, this is, for me, in my opinion, this is the hardest part of professional poker, which is, you know, how do you manage yourself essentially when you're going through downswings? This has nothing to do with like
analytics or your skills of cards. This is just mastery of yourself, like your emotional and mental state. You go in with like a game plan, like you feel like you know what you're doing when you are in a downswing or when everything's working against you and nothing's working at all. I think the trick is being able to follow that same game plan and not deviate. It's about not deviating from what you already like know to be like a good like solid game, a good solid strategy. Just because things aren't working out doesn't necessarily mean you're playing badly. But I am still quietly confident that I will be able to turn a profit by the end of this trip. Just gonna go back now and then reset again for tomorrow. Thanks for listening. I'll speak to you next time.
Right, so just to take a quick look at the results, we managed to end the session down $1,522. As a summary for the week, I ended last week down $5,635. I am still quietly confident that I will at least not lose money by the end of this trip. Right, take care guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.